Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Stratford Hall, where we are committed to providing top quality educational content representing a wide variety of voices here from Stratford Hall's history. My name is Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffi, and I'm the Director of Research and the Jesse Ball DuPont Memorial Library, where you're sitting. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome, and I am delighted to introduce a longtime friend of Stratford Hall, Dr. Alan C. Guelzo. Dr. Guelzo is a New York Times bestseller author, an American historian and public intellectual with work published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the National Review, and elsewhere. He's been the recipient of the Lincoln Prize 3 times. Is that right? Three times, the Guggenheim Lehrman Prize for Military History, and many other honors, too numerous to list here. Dr. Guelzo is currently Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar and Director of the James Madison Program Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship. Previously, he was Senior Research Scholar in the Council of the Humanities at Princeton University and the Director of Civil War Era Studies and the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era at Gettysburg College. He holds the MA and PhD in History from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Guelzo is author of several books about the Civil War and early 19th century American history, notably Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President of 1999, and most recently, an engaging, well-researched, and nuanced analysis of the life of Stratford-born Robert Edward Lee. The book is titled Robert E. Lee, A Life. The talk tonight is Robert E. Lee and the Pursuit of Perfection. Please join me in welcoming to Stratford Hall and the Jesse Ball DuPont Memorial Library, Dr. Alan C. Guelzo.
Thank you, Gordon, and thanks to all who are here this evening, both really and virtually. It is a pleasure to be back at Stratford Hall, this wonderful place, and here enjoying the Northern Neck and everything that's associated with it. It's a very special place, a very wonderful place, and it's always been a great pleasure for my family to be able to visit here. So thank you for the opportunity once again to be part of life here at Stratford and here in Westmoreland County, and to talk this evening about one of the most famous sons of Westmoreland, which in this case was Robert E. Lee. How do you speak of Robert E. Lee? For a long time, that wasn't difficult, because for almost a century after Lee's death in 1870, Lee was embalmed in American memories. Not only memories, but in books, in postage stamps, in school exercises. And in all of these cases, he was laid out before us as a blend of nobility and sorrow, second only to Washington or to Lincoln, and in some places, not even second to them. If you look at the ways in which Robert E. Lee was spoken of, he's sometimes described as chivalrous knight of the lost cause. In the overflowing eloquence of Clifford Doughty, Lee fashioned his Army of Northern Virginia as a kind of personally designed, hand-wrought sword, fending off machine-tooled weapons that kept coming in immeasurable, illimitable numbers, as though Lee was a kind of Tennysonian King Arthur, holding off the grimy forces of industrial modernity. Just as Lee fought for Virginia rather than slavery, so, according to Doughty, did the Confederacy stand for some other principle, for courage and high purpose, for constitutional purity, not for human bondage. In other hands, Lee was also the exemplar of pure duty, as he understood it. When Virginia seceded from the Union, Lincoln's course, Lee's course, was now plain, explained his very first biographer, James McCabe, in 1868. Though his own judgment assured him it would bring great suffering and disaster upon his state, nevertheless, Lee was convinced that it was his duty to obey the command of Virginia without questioning it. There was no more trace of ambition or sectional hatred in Lee's decision. It was purely the result of a conscientious conviction of duty. And, said McCabe, had Lee believed it his duty to remain in the service of the United States, he would have done so at any sacrifice of his personal feelings. Even in defeat, Lee is the emblem of duty, since John William James declared in his 1906 Life and Letters of Robert Edward Lee, after the surrender, he determined it was his duty to remain in his native state, share her fortunes, and abide all the perils of personal danger, which then seemed to surround him. On top of this, Lee was also described in the awestruck gaze of John Esten Cook as the paragon of moral integrity, whose erect and graceful figure revealed his elevated character, the consciousness of command, a species of moral and official grandeur which it was impossible to mistake. According to John Esten Cook, God had given many men the gift of moral greatness, but to only one of them had he given the additional grace of looking great. 40 years later, Gamaliel Bradford in 1912 held Lee up as absolutely moral and practical, with a self-control that was no less a spiritual grace than a moral victory. His very bearing and presence produced an atmosphere of purity. And then Lee was the American version of the 19th century's model Christian soldier, Sir Henry Havelock, a man of undemonstrative but perfectly devout Christianity. Lee's one-time lieutenant, John Brown Gordon, addressing a memorial meeting in Atlanta 3 days after Lee's death, described Lee as a Christian like Havelock, recognizing his duty to his God above every other earthly consideration, with a native modesty that refused to appreciate the glory of his own, and which surrounds now his entire character and career with a halo of unfading light, with an integrity of life and a sacred regard for truth which no man can dare assail, with a fidelity to principle which no misfortune could shake. Above all, when speaking about Robert E. Lee, people spoke of him as the peerless strategist and tactician, never defeated except when finally ground down by the odds. Lee was no harebrained leader, but a profound thinker, following the highest principles of the military art, said Stonewall Jackson's British biographer, Lieutenant Colonel G.F.R. Henderson, in 1900. And Britain's most modern of Victorian major generals, Sir Garnet Wolseley, told the New York Sun in 1887 that Lee's combinations to secure victory were the conceptions of a truly great strategist. But when they had been effected, the tactics were then almost everything that could be desired up to the moment of victory. Well, victory was, of course, what in the end eluded Robert E. Lee. And to the skeptical among us, these heaps of adulation for Lee can easily look like the clever inventions of Southerners to compensate for the fact that theirs was really a poorly managed cause on behalf of a morally repellent principle, which is human chattel slavery. And yet, these hymns of praise for Robert E. Lee were not entirely, or even mostly, inventions. Descriptions of Lee as a cadet at West Point in the 1820s teem with the vocabulary of perfection. He graduates with no conduct demerits, He misses graduating at the head of his class by mere decimal points in the numerical grading system. And he's appointed class adjutant, then the highest student rank at the academy. His correctness of demeanor and language and attention to duties, personal and official, were regarded by his West Point classmate, Joseph E. Johnston, with awe, and gave him a superiority that everyone acknowledged in his heart, yet without touching their affection for him. As a staff officer in the Mexican War, Lee quickly catapults upward in the esteem of Winfield Scott, who commanded the great expedition that captured Mexico City. He becomes Scott's most trusted subordinate. And in the post-war years, Scott would confide to Reverdy Johnson that more than once, his success was largely due to the skill, valor, and undaunted energy of Robert E. Lee. In 1861, Lee declines field command of the federal armies being organized to subdue the Confederacy, frankly admitting that I look upon secession as anarchy and on slavery as so repellent that if I owned the 4 millions of slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But, he pleads, how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state? A question he asked as though he was being asked to rape his mother. All through the declining fortunes of the Confederacy, Lee remains as emotionally unmoved as Keats's patient, sleepless eremite. Colonel Arthur Fremantle, the British observer at Gettysburg, thought that Lee's posture there, as the broken fragments of Pickett's division streamed past him, was perfectly sublime. Fremantle described him in terms bordering on awe. Lee, he said, in his worshipful 3 months in the southern states, was engaged in rallying and in encouraging the broken troops, and was riding about a little in front of the wood, quite alone, without showing any signs of the slightest disappointment, care, or annoyance, and he was addressing to every soldier he met a few words of encouragement. In the end, Lee decides to surrender his army rather than turn it loose as an insurgency. And he agrees to the humble task of serving as president of a small, near bankrupt college in the Upper Shenandoah. In the ultimate tribute, men name their sons for him. Robert Lee Jones, the actor. Robert Lee Smith, the maternal grandfather of Elvis Presley. Robert Lee Frost, the poet. In 1959, Robert Penn Warren had to confess to a sense of bafflement at Lee, whom he said was as smooth as an egg, like a sainted grandmother with no detectable flaws. And when Roy Blount, in his 2006 collection of essays, had to write about me and Bobby E. Lee, the Southern-born Blount's best modern comparison for Lee was, astoundingly, Colin Powell. All the same, we have come lately to doubt much of the Lee story. We have begun to entertain suspicions about his military capacity. Suspicions first raised by JFC Fuller, another British Major General and a quasi-fascist, in his 1933 Grant and Lee, where Fuller dismissed Lee as one of the most incapable generals-in-chief in history. We have developed still more doubts about Lee's nobility of character, especially on the subject of race, after Michael Fellman announced that Lee never questioned his belief in the inferiority of blacks as a race and consciously surrendered himself to the larger Southern white project of Jim Crow. And we are no longer so sure about the smoothness of the Lee Eggs character after Elizabeth Brown Pryor asserted that the same Lee who claimed that he had never known one moment of bitterness or resentment after the Civil War was, in private, the author of letters that throb with controlled rage as they sought to justify the preeminence of states' rights and expressed an overt dislike, even fear, of majority politics and strong federal government. In fact, after Thomas Connolly's slashing denunciation of Lee in The Marble Man, Robert E. Lee and His Image in American Society in 1977, the first Robert E. Lee book I ever read, there, Connolly struck at Lee on every one of these points on which he has been praised, as soldier, as citizen, as moral example. And he struck at them so vehemently that we are not sure that we can speak of Robert E. Lee at all. And the rash of Lee's statue topplings and removals since 2017 is a sign of how little privilege remains attached to the name of Robert E. Lee. In the process of destroying a myth, it is always possible to create a counter myth, which turns out to be just as vulnerable to question as its original. It is true, as we've begun to realize, that Robert E. Lee was a deeply conflicted man. But the conflicts turn out to be much more varied than we have suspected. To begin with, there is the long shadow cast over Lee by his father, the over-celebrated Revolutionary cavalryman, Light Horse Harry Lee. It is a shadow cast by absence, since Light Horse Harry proved to be as spectacularly inept as a property owner and politician and head of household on the Northern Neck as he had once been spectacularly talented on the battlefields of the Revolution. Light Horse Harry had all the makings of a typical Northern Neck squire. He had a Princeton education, like James Madison, another famous Virginian. He had a successful marriage to a wealthy widow who happened to be the cousin who put Stratford Hall into his hands. And he was an influential person in terms of recruiting the patronage of another great Northern Neck planter, George Washington. But Light Horse Harry somehow managed to squander all of it. Investments in absurd real estate speculations burned up his wife's cash. And when she died and he remarried to Anne Hill Carter, he burned up as much of her cash as he could claim as well. By 1811, Light Horse Harry had moved his family to the easier circumstances of Alexandria. But as a Federalist, he was now embroiled in political conflicts with Virginia's Jeffersonians. After a near fatal beating and a political riot, he announced his departure to the West Indies, ostensibly in search of health, but in fact, in search of escape from his creditors and political enemies. Light Horse Harry's fall was partly a matter of his own colossal financial miscalls, but partly a result of the overall economic climate that fell upon Westmoreland County and the Northern Neck after the Revolution. The old mansions, where they had been spared by fire, sighed John Randolph of Roanoke, are fast falling to decay. And the great families of the Neck, like the Lees, are dispersed from St. Mary's to St. Louis. Virginians, whose fathers rode in coaches and drank the choicest wines, now ride on saddlebags, complained Randolph in 1814, and drink grog when they can get it. What enterprise or capital there was in the country retired westward. Like so many of the old pre-revolutionary gentry, Light Horse Harry never returned to Stratford, or for that matter, to Alexandria. Robert, his youngest son, was 6 years old when his father departed and never laid eyes on him again. Anyone who would like to measure the impact of that loss can do so merely by noticing that for more than 40 years, from 1825 until nearly his death, in a correspondence that amounted to thousands of letters, Robert E. Lee never once mentioned his father. The miserable example of Light Horse Harry stimulated a determination in Robert Lee to practice a kind of redemptive perfection, as if to wipe out all record of his father's failures. Even more, it drove him to a pursuit of independence, partly from his father's reputation, but also from dependence on any others who might likewise fail him. "I am fond of independence," Lee wrote to his own eldest son, Custis. "It is that feeling that prompts me to come up strictly to the requirements of law and regulations. I wish neither to seek or receive indulgence from anyone. I wish to feel under obligation to no one." But alongside that passion for independence, Lee was whipsawed by a passion for the security that his father had robbed him of. A passion which leads him to marry into the Custis family and to remain in the United States Army, even when he was frequently waiting, looking, and hoping for some good opportunity to bid an affectionate farewell to my Uncle Sam. These conflicting impulses set up extraordinary emotional riptides in Lee's life. Robert E. Lee never owns a house of his own, making his home with his in-laws at Arlington after marrying Mary Custis in 1831. And he spends most of his life between then and 1861 on duty elsewhere: Fort Monroe, St. Louis, Fort Hamilton, Mexico, Fort Carroll in Baltimore, West Point as superintendent, and Texas. He chooses to serve the Confederacy, but he is its most unsparing critic during the Civil War. When this war began, I was opposed to it, bitterly opposed to it. He railed to Custis Lee in 1865. "I told these people that unless every man should do his whole duty, they would repent it. And now they will repent." The Confederate Congress was the most feckless of all, in Lee's opinion, since they do not seem to be able to do anything except eat peanuts and chew tobacco, while my army is starving. It is only in the years after the war, as president of Washington College, that Lee is able to achieve any significant resolution of these conflicts, largely because, as president and as General Lee, nobody, trustees, faculty, or students, was in any position to disagree with him. When he first took charge of Washington College, recalled John William Jones, he at once, in his quiet way, gave both professors and students to understand that he was president and meant to control the affairs of the institution. He dismissed the college rule book, informing incoming students in what seemed like a stroke of generosity that we have no printed rules. We have but one rule here, and it is that every student must be a gentleman. But far from generosity, what this meant in practice was that Robert E. Lee was the judge, jury, and executioner of what composed a gentleman. No wonder then that the Washington College years were probably the happiest years of his life. No wonder either that it was in these years that Lee was sufficiently at peace with his past to write a 70-page memoir of his father, to be published as a preface to a new edition of Light Horse Harry's history of the Revolution's Southern campaigns. He may not have been exaggerating when he shocked one Washington College student by remarking that the great mistake of my life was taking a military education. Well, mistake or not, It is also true, Fuller and Connolly to the contrary, that Robert E. Lee was a perceptive strategist, but not quite in the way we usually imagine. Lee was, after all, trained as an engineer, which in the 1820s was what a West Point education largely trained everyone who came under its rule. Lee spent most of his career building or rebuilding things, fortifications in Baltimore and New York City, the St. Louis Wars. And it comes as a surprise to realize that Robert E. Lee never commanded troops in combat until he was hastily commandeered by the Secretary of War to suppress John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. His first assignment in the field as a Confederate field commander in Western Virginia in the late summer and fall of 1861 was a botch. Lee only blossomed into the grand military master of the Confederacy in June of 1862 in the Peninsula Campaign. But even there, Lee's great gift was not hands-on tactical leadership. His aide-de-camp and secretary, Walter Taylor, wrote years later that General Lee always accorded his corps commanders great liberty in the exercise of their discretion as to the manner of the execution of his orders. Having made clear his general plans, he left to them the details of carrying them out. Instead, Lee's mind ran not toward tactics, but toward strategic concept. And the direction that took was at variance with much of the thinking of the Confederate leadership. For almost a year, Confederate politicians assumed that they could safely stand on the defensive and allow any federal forces to beat their heads against that defense until they tired. Or, if any federal armies did manage to penetrate that defense, the vast hinterlands of the Confederacy would easily decoy the enemy into the interior and then to cut them off, as were Braddock and Burgoyne. Lee, on the other hand, who had spent a surprisingly large portion of his engineering career in the North, understood clearly that the South was too woefully under-resourced to accomplish even that. If the Confederates were to win their independence, they would have to secure a quick knockout. And the way to do that was to leap to the offensive, carry the war north, and make war on Northern public opinion, convincing Northerners that they could not win and forcing the Lincoln administration to the negotiating table. I think it all important. We should assume the aggressive, he advised the Confederate leaders, urging a campaign north of the Potomac. For one thing, greater relief would, in this way, be afforded to the armies in Middle Tennessee than by any other method. But what was more persuasive was the certainty that a Confederate invasion of the North would trigger a great change in public opinion in the North. Lincoln's Republicans will be destroyed, and Northern Democrats, acting as the friends of peace, will become so strong as that the next administration will go in on that basis. Otherwise, if Confederate armies merely sat on their haunches and tried to protect their logistical centers, federal armies would simply clamp sieges around them, and that would be the end. Follow that course, he scolded one of his subordinates, and we shall at last be obliged to take refuge behind the works of Richmond and stand a siege which would be but a work of time. This advice is utterly at variance with what might be expected from the only Army engineer to attain senior command of armies in the field in the Civil War. His nearest competition among engineers was George Gordon Meade. Lee's own staff heard mutterings that General Lee was merely an engineer and that the troops under him would be more familiar with a spade than a musket. For that reason, it has become common to look for an explanation of Lee's aggressiveness in some hidden quirk of his character. A great deal, for instance, has been made over the years out of E.P. Alexander's famous comment, handed to him by Joseph Ives, a Northern educated staffer of Jefferson Davis's, that if there is a man in either army head and shoulders above all others in audacity, that man is Lee, and you will live to see it. A judgment which has led to speculation that Lee was possessed by some bizarre thirst for the offensive, which foolishly led him to bleed his armies dry. Well, it is true that Lee's armies did suffer substantial casualties, higher even than those suffered by troops commanded by Ulysses Grant, who was more often tagged as a butcher and a human meat grinder. And Pickett's charge is usually offered up as the prime example of headstrong recklessness, as though Robert E. Lee had really turned out to be his father's son after all. But Lee's audacity sat at a considerable distance from mere unreasoning instinct, something which Lee himself explained to William Allen in the years after the war. No one who takes big chances and fails ever gets points afterwards for wisdom. Such criticism is obvious, Lee remarked. But the disparity of force between the contending forces rendered the risks unavoidable. And Robert Conquest, in a particularly perceptive evaluation of Lee in 1975, wrote, Lee always preferred, as he put it, the risks of action to the certain loss of inaction. But if he was not one of those generals whose caution leads them into a dead end of timid defensiveness, nor was he a shallow-minded virtuoso, seeking always the brilliant risk for its own sake. His audacity was the result of a profound consideration of the chances. Lee was, after all, not only an engineer, but an observer of Winfield Scott's lightning offensive toward Mexico City in 1847. Scott's offensive-mindedness set an example for Robert E. Lee, which had much more weight with Lee than the example of Light Horse Harry. The mention of Winfield Scott should be a reminder that a great deal of the myth-making and remaking about Robert E. Lee emerges from the 4 years of his life as a Confederate general. And given the fact that his historical reputation rests almost completely on what he did during those years, that's not necessarily a mistake. But it is nevertheless curious how overwhelmingly biographers have concentrated on the Civil War years and missed the cues to understanding Lee that are embedded in the 54 years that preceded them. Clifford Doughty's highly readable 1965 biography of Lee amounts to 734 pages. Of them, Doughty uses just 135 pages to get to the Civil War and squeezes the Washington College years into the last 84. The Mount Everest of Lee biography, Douglas Southall Freeman's R.E. Lee, sprawls across 4 volumes in the 1930s. But we get to the Civil War just 2/3 of the way through volume 1. And Freeman only has Lee arriving at Washington College as late as halfway through volume 4. Now, perhaps this is simply a reflection of the fact that Lee's pre-war and post-war careers, frankly, made for less than interesting reading or research. But it is also possible that the non-Civil War parts of his life are more difficult to square with the myths and the re-myths. So, was he indeed the paragon of moral integrity? In many ways, yes. John Schofield, who was a cadet at West Point during Lee's superintendency there in the 1850s, remembered Lee as the personification of dignity, justice, and kindness, the ideal of a commanding officer. Other cadets found Lee to be a stiffly pressed, perfection-demanding iron pants, and behind his back, they sang songs decrying the merits of old Bob Lee and stating his cruelties to cadets. And although Lee himself never seems to have owned more than one slave family, inherited from his mother. He benefited from the labors of the nearly 200 others owned by his in-laws. And in a damaging incident published across the country in 1859, he had 3 fugitives from Arlington whipped. And yet these are the same slaves whom, in conscientious obedience to his father-in-law's will, Lee emancipates in December 1862, at a time when almost no other white Southerner would have objected if he had declined to do so, will or not. Was Robert E. Lee voted to duty? Yes. But his decision to refuse command of federal troops in 1861 and then assume command of Virginia and then Confederate forces amounts to what must unavoidably be interpreted as treason, both in terms of the oath he took at his commissioning in 1829 and the Constitution's definition of treason as levying war against the United States, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Was he a humble Christian who told Beverly Tucker Lacey in 1864, "I am nothing but a poor sinner, trusting in Christ alone for salvation"? Well, certainly Lee was baptized as an Episcopalian, although no actual record of the baptism survives in the archives of the Diocese of Virginia. And he was catechized as an adolescent by Bishop William Meade at Christ Church, Alexandria. But there is no hard evidence that Lee ever developed any religious sensibilities beyond that of a decent, polite, low church Virginia Episcopalianism. Like many fatherless children, he grew up struggling to grasp a concept of God. And his actual references to religion are vague and pulseless, and on a few occasions, comical. He was not actually confirmed in the Episcopal Church until 1855, and then largely because his teenaged daughters were undergoing confirmation. And judging by their letters and journals, it has to be said that they were more pious than he was. Toward the end of his life, Lee would admit to his wife that he wished he felt sure of his acceptance with God. She reassured him that all who love and trust in the Savior need not fear, but he did not reply. Was Lee submissive and noble in defeat? Yes, but mostly because he got terms from Ulysses Grant that he could live with. His entire army was paroled and allowed to return home without molestation by federal authorities, instead of being interned in prison camps, or worse, paraded through the streets of Washington or New York like captives in a Roman triumph, with himself and his principal officers on trial for their lives. These were the soldiers he praised in his final message to his army for their 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, overcome only in the end by overwhelming numbers and resources. However, his final report to Jefferson Davis after the surrender is another matter, since it is tinged with bitterness at the Army of Northern Virginia's mortifying collapse on its retreat from Richmond. The troops, Lee wrote, were not marked by the boldness and decision which formerly characterized them. And all along the march, they appeared to Lee feeble, and a want of confidence seemed to possess officers and men. These men, rather than displaying courage and fortitude, threw away their arms while others followed the wagon trains and embarrassed their progress. Even they had failed his demand for perfection. How then shall we speak of Robert E. Lee? We can say that he was an American of great talents, especially as an engineer, but also as a military strategist. And we can say that when compared with the feckless record of his contemporaries in America and Europe in the mid-19th century, people like George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, and Joe Hooker, like Marshall McMahon, Marshall Bazaine, and Marshall Benedict. By comparison with them, Lee scaled almost Napoleonic heights of accomplishment. We may also say that he was a traumatized child who grew up struggling to repair the damage of that trauma by seeking a perfection which demanded more of himself and of others than it was easy to achieve. We may say also that he was a Southerner who understood clearly the wrong of slavery, even to the point of calling it in 1856 a moral and political evil in any country, and yet who allowed himself, like so many Upper South slaveholders, to believe that the final abolition of human slavery could only occur at some distant future, known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence. Which is to say that, like the so-called good Germans described by W.G. Sebold, Lee's feelings of shame and defiance impelled him to look at the evil of slavery and then look away. And we may say that he was a man who made the wrong decision at the most important moment of his life and did not know how to unmake it then or afterward. Robert E. Lee is a man of complications, but not complexity. He is not a tragic figure like Oedipus, whose tragedy lay, like the other classical Greek tragic figures, in not turning out to be the man he thought he was. But he is not, on the other hand, a villain like Iago, who mischievously plots the humiliation, downfall, and death of others. He is rather the flawed warrior, like Achilles, who is driven by circumstances he does not entirely understand to his own destruction. He is, in the words of the Iliad, to fates averse and nursed for future woes, so short a space the light of heaven to view, so short a space and filled with sorrow too. Perhaps in the end, Lee was right. His great mistake in life had been that military education. Thank you very much. And now I think Kelly is going to supervise opening the floor, virtually and otherwise.
So questions will probably rotate back and forth. I will man the computer, and if somebody here wants to start it off, give me a second to get this ready. We're good. That was wonderful. Thank you.
All right, very good. Well, I expect at that moment the floor is open.
Yes.
All right, I see a questioner right here.
The talk was wonderful. I'm wondering if you can comment on, after the war, when he enters Washington College, he is encouraging people in the South to just kind of reconcile with the North and let Reconstruction happen. I'm wondering if you think that is part of that smooth veneer, or if he actually believes it's the right course of action.
Well, he does believe it's the right course of action. Although the motivations for moving in that direction are numerous. On the one hand, this is someone whose enthusiasm for a separate, independent Southern nation never even came close to the kind of almost maniac dedication you get in Jefferson Davis or people like that. This is someone who starts out by saying that the secession isn't really secession at all, it's revolution. And he never swerves from that opinion. He is a very decided but very quiet critic of the Confederate regime. So he can look in the post-war years and say, all right, that's over, that's past. Now we have to realize that we really are one country and we need to move ahead that way. And he really does think that way because in some respects, he's always thought that way. There's also a more practical aspect of it too. And that is the South is under Reconstruction. That includes Virginia. That means not only the presence of federal soldiers, but it also means the presence of federal military tribunals, of federal authority, of federal supervision, and above all, of the domination of the political landscape by Virginia Unionists, many of whom felt they had a lot of scores to settle from before the war and during the war. Lee realizes that a step in the wrong direction could bring Washington College right down into the dust. There would be no way to appeal from a federal military decision to close the college if some determination was made that students, faculty, trustees were behaving in some way that was inimical to Reconstruction. So he has to think first and foremost about what is going to conduce to the survival of Washington College. And if that means that you make peace with federal authorities, well, that's the price that's going to have to be paid if we're going to survive. Because if we don't, if we adopt a defiant position, what are we going to get for it? The answer is really nothing. In fact, maybe less than nothing. So he will rebuff efforts over the years made by, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan to recruit him or to recruit students as part of its movement. And he will rebuff them, first of all, because he doesn't like them. Remember, he is a Lee. It's born on the Northern Neck. And the people who compose the Ku Klux Klan are, in his view, usually the worst sorts of scum in Southern society that he really does not want to touch. There's a certain element of let's call it noblesse oblige, that's motivating Lee's view of them. But at the same time, there's also this sense that any kind of dalliance with movements like the Klan was simply going to put a stick into the hand of people who wanted to beat not just Washington College, but Southerners as a whole over and over again. He sees as his mission convincing Northerners that everything that happened in the war is now past history. We are moving forward, and therefore you should step in and supply the endowment of Washington College with Northern money. And of course you should, because there's no Southern money to endow it. Washington College, when Lee becomes its president, has as its financial resource a lot of worthless Confederate currency and bonds, and some of the original stock that had been willed to it by George Washington. That's why the place was named for Washington. And apart from that, they didn't have enough to buy baseball cards, if there had been baseball cards then. He has to raise money. Where is that money going to be found? Not in the South, not after the Civil War. It's going to be found in the North. And Lee finds it. In fact, one of the things that people don't often appreciate about Robert E. Lee is that this man really knew how to shake the trees in terms of donor cultivation. And he did it, first of all, he did it with Northerners who were Southern born, who had a certain connection to, especially to Virginia. And he works over people like old Colonel McCormick in Chicago. And he sweet talks them and he convinces them and he brings them around to support Washington College. So by the time he dies in 1870, he's built the endowment of Washington College up to $250,000. Now in 1865, that's a lot of moolah. And it's not just that he's able to work on the sensitivities of those who have some nostalgic past connection to the South. There's even this remarkable event, a fundraising event that takes place at Cooper Institute in New York City. This is the same Cooper Institute where Abraham Lincoln makes his famous speech in February of 1860 that does so much to get him nominated for the presidency. This event is held at Cooper Institute to raise funds for Washington College. And who is the principal speaker? Henry Ward Beecher, Mr. Abolitionist, the Billy Graham of his day. And not only that, but Beecher delivers this oration in which he says, if I had been born in the South and educated in the South like Robert E. Lee, I would have done the same things he did. You're thinking, what? This was how successful Lee was at repositioning and reinventing the reputation of a place like Washington College. So in a sense, money sticks to his fingers going into the college. He's able to rebuild things. He's able to build up the faculty. The student body grows from 12 in 1865 to over 400. He makes Washington into a powerhouse among American colleges. When people think about Robert E. Lee, they think about the great military strategist. This man was a great educational and institutional strategist. And there's many an educational institution today that could wish it had somebody like that at its helm. So he's very successful that way. In order to get to that success, though, he must navigate the political minefields. And there are many people who are skeptical of this. There are a number of observers who point out, yeah, Robert E. Lee might himself be a man of upright integrity. But look at the students of his college, General Lee's boys. They're going around beating up free Black people. They're going around disrupting schools that have been opened by the American Missionary Association for educating former slaves. These may not be taking direct orders from Robert E. Lee, but he certainly isn't creating an atmosphere that discourages them. Now, to a certain extent, he does, because when he does find that there are some people who are misbehaving particularly badly, he will expel students like that. And he will warn them, you are not to be found creating trouble. You're not to be found doing these kinds of things in the town of Lexington. So he says that. But the question that always comes to mind, is he saying that because, all right, this is real conviction on his part, or is it institutional self-protection? As I say, there were many people who were skeptical of this. The northern newspapers frequently report on these things with an upraised eyebrow, as if to say, yeah, right. Yeah, this is self-interest. This is not some lofty sense of commitment to a post-Civil War future. So you can look at Lee, and yes, his behavior is oriented in directions that look towards a new kind of South that will emerge from out of the Civil War. But the motivations for it are complex. There are many streams that feed into that. Just as there are many streams that feed into all of our decisions this way. As much as we would like to believe that every decision that we make, public and private, is noble and elevated and free from sin, we know better. The snaky tongue of self-interest wags out more often than we like to admit. We should not be terribly surprised that it shows itself in Robert Lee as president of Washington College. What one has to say, though, at the end of the day is Lee could have done much worse. Lee could have been a force for infinitely more lethal and toxic ideas. And he does not. And that much, I think, has to be put to a certain degree to his credit. He could have done some terrible things. He did not. Even if he did not always do what we might have hoped he would in the most dramatic way, at least he refrained from doing what could have been more harmful. So that much belongs to his credit. Yes, in the back. Oh, Karen, yes, I see. All right.
He does not mention scholarly. Because mentions track and his family roots. And I wanted to see that how does Robert E. Lee tease apart Stratford and the Lee family from the scholar?
Stratford, in some technical sense, was never really within the grasp of Robert E. Lee. The property came into the hands of his father from marrying his cousin Matilda. Matilda, of course, was the daughter of Philip Lee, who was the owner of Stratford. And Lighthorse Harry in a sense, only becomes the master of Stratford in an indirect way as the husband of Matilda. They have several children. The oldest of them is Harry the fourth of the Harry Lees. And after Matilda dies, Light Horse Harry remarries to Anne Hill Carter. And among the children that they have, well, there are 2 daughters, there are 3 sons, and Robert is the youngest of the sons. All right, that lays out the whole family relationship there. Now, what does that mean for Stratford? Stratford technically would descend through Matilda. That meant it would go to Harry the Fourth from the first marriage, not to the children of the second marriage. So when Harry the Fourth comes of age, when he turns 21, he becomes the legal title holder to Stratford. And more or less at the same time, Light Horse Harry moves out of Stratford to Alexandria. Now, Robert could have had only the dimmest of early childhood memories of Stratford at that point. We know from the fact that in years to come, he would circle back to Stratford in the summers when his mother and his siblings did this kind of summer vacation tour to all of their relatives, to Carter relatives, to Fitzhugh relatives, and then here to Stratford. And Lee recalled how growing up he would hunt and fish on the Stratford property. So he had some personal interaction with Stratford. At no point is he even close to the title of Stratford. So you have to wonder, what role did Stratford really play in his memory? And especially after he leaves home to go to West Point and to enter the army, does Stratford really mean anything to him? Because by that point, his older half-brother has become the master of Stratford. And Harry the Fourth, oh my goodness, if you thought Light Horse Harry was bad, they did not call Harry the Fourth Black Horse Harry for nothing. And not to enter into the seamy details, which is the kind of thing you'd only expect on the pages of the National Enquirer, Harry the Fourth loses control of Stratford completely. And in fact, the property goes into the hands of another family. And you think at that point, all right, then Robert E. Lee, who never really had direct connection to Stratford, it wouldn't make any difference to him. No. In December of 1861, Robert E. Lee writes 2 very peculiar letters. One of them is in response to 2 of his daughters who had visited Stratford. I mean, this is December of 1861 when Confederate lines were still the Potomac. In fact, the Potomac at that point was still closed. It was still blockaded to Union traffic. Well, his daughters visit Stratford and they tell him about it. And he writes back to them and says, that was really wonderful of you to visit Stratford. You know, I've always been interested in Stratford. I wonder if it's for sale. I'd like to buy it. And you think, all right, maybe that's what he's writing to his children. No, he turns around and writes to his wife, Mary Custis Lee, says the same thing. I've always wanted to buy Stratford. Is it for sale? You're thinking, what? What is going on there? What hold does the image of Stratford have on him? Does he see himself in this case as the man who is going to redeem the follies of his father, of his elder brother, of the Lees who fecklessly lost control of Stratford? Is he going to rewrite the script of a childhood that went awry by acquiring Stratford? Now, I can't get him on the couch and ask him those questions. I'm not sure he'd answer if I did. But the letters themselves are peculiar. Why does Stratford exercise this gravitational tug on Lee's memory and emotions in 1861? And if you have an answer, please let me know. I want to write it out for me on a 3x5 card. I want to file that. But it is a peculiar moment. Just when you might have thought that Robert E. Lee, this was so far in his past that it wouldn't have made any significance. Stratford wouldn't have figured it at all in his calculations. Nevertheless, he's thinking in December of 1861, I want to buy Stratford. At that moment, you can only say, what? because there's really not an easy answer.
We get a question from Zoom.
Sure.
I haven't asked you to repeat the question from the audience when it comes up. Okay, so a ton of questions there, which is fantastic. Drew Harris wants to know what was Lee's relationship with other prominent former Confederates after the war?
Not very much. And this is another peculiar thing. After the Civil War, Union generals, Grant, Sherman, even McClellan, have regular contact with their former officers. When Grant becomes president, for instance, he takes a lot of his former officers and puts them into positions and political positions in his administration, which they promptly botch. They might have been good soldiers and they might have been good administrators, but putting them in political office was a big mistake. And Grant pays the penalty for that. But Grant stays in touch with people. Sherman does. McClellan comes back to reunions of the Army of the Potomac. And by contrast, Lee doesn't have those kinds of connections. He'll correspond occasionally with some former officers who write to him, but his major lieutenant, like James Longstreet, for instance, his correspondence with Longstreet is infrequent and distant and unencouraging. He does not attend reunions. He does not encourage his former subordinates to find any kind of fellow feeling. He doesn't invite them to Lexington. When he does, in fact, go out of the Shenandoah Valley, sometimes he will visit with some of them, but not more than that. He doesn't try to create or recreate the environment, the camp environment of the war. And in that respect, it's a very puzzling sort of thing. It is as though Lee, when he steps out of the war, also steps away from many of the people who had served under him during the war. Why is that? Was it that he felt no loyalty to them? Again, these are questions which don't have particularly easy answers. What we do know is that Lee suffered during the war from a sense that he didn't have a very deep bench in the the command echelons of the Army of Northern Virginia. He made a comment one time when John Bell Hood pressed him. This was in 1863, before Gettysburg. And Hood had questions he was asking Lee about command responsibilities. And Lee's response was very peculiar, because he said, the ordinary soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia don't have peers anywhere in the world. You can give them orders to go any place, they'll go, they'll do what they have to do. It's the officers. I can't get the officers to obey my orders. I can't get them to do what I want. So is his post-war distance from those who served with him a measure of his disenchantment that even they didn't measure up to his expectations of perfection? That's a question I think that hangs out there in midair. Yes.
Doctor, I'd like to go back to the comment Lee, whether he was a Brigadier General and the contemporary account of him not being focused on.
Yes.
So, as someone with an extensive military background, I know a lot of people interested in but they really and the Humanities general economy, he damn well better not be focused on capital.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you know, OBJ and
Right.
You micromanage things and you lose point of the big picture. That happens in modern days. I've heard the commanding general from Allied Force mention him making that mistake once when the F-117 was shot down. He said, I got sucked into the tactical level of war. And I completely lost the picture that I need. So as the commander of the army, better be focused on the strategic and the operational level, or he has people below him who should be focused on individual tactics. I find it basically impossible to believe that, considering the disparity between the size of the army, and more importantly, how they were researched, he could have not been an exceptional military leader to have lasted as long as he did have the success that they had.
Well, I'd respond to it, first of all, by expanding on what you're saying about the basic areas of responsibility that any worthwhile general officer has. We could divide those up rather generally into three categories. One is the tactical, and that is what's happening on the battlefield itself. The strategic, the big picture, so to speak, and the logistical, that is how you supply and equip an army and keep it supplied and equipped so that it can function. Lee, I think, is a superior strategist because Lee is one of those people who has the coup of the eye. He can look at the overall situation and see what needs to be done. He can see what the situation is liable to be 18 months out. He can see what has to be done at a distance. He can see and measure what the impact of certain decisions is going to be. In that respect, I think he's a very capable strategic thinker. And in that respect, I part company with people like Thomas Connolly. Connolly, who at one point said, I think a little recklessly, that Robert E. Lee was one of the worst things that ever happened to the South. I think, no, that's really not the case. That's really not the case. As a strategic thinker, he is very, very effective. He can see what a lot of others do not see. We don't see a whole lot of him as a tactical commander. And that's partly a choice of his own. Because as Lee himself explained to the Prussian army observer, Colonel, the engineering colonel, Major Schreiber, he said to Schreiber that my task is to get my army in its various pieces to a particular battlefield. When I get them to the battlefield, then it's time for my lieutenants to take over and do their job. And in that respect, Lee was actually taking a point of view that harks back to Napoleon, and which you see in a number of great commanders who have very carefully selected who their lieutenants were. And in fact, that was very effective for Lee when he had lieutenants that he could rely on, when he had a Stonewall Jackson with whom he could communicate on an almost intuitive level. In some respect, Lee only had to think it and Jackson would go do it. And something similar takes place with James Longstreet. People have been very critical about Longstreet. I'm not so enthused about the criticisms because Longstreet, again, is someone with whom Lee communicates on a very easy and fundamental level. So long as he has people like Jackson and Longstreet at his service, then he can step back and let them do it. And the best example of it is what happens at Second Bull Run, where Jackson and Longstreet basically take over the show on the ground, and they come within an ace of destroying the Army of the Potomac. Problem was, at Chancellorsville, Jackson is wounded and dies from pneumonia 10 days later. All right, Jackson goes off the board. Longstreet, almost a year later, in almost exactly the same place, is shot. He survives, but he's months out of action. Combat in the Civil War took the lives of a lot of his most trusted subordinates. And absent a Jackson and a Longstreet, and Robert E. Lee suddenly has to start taking tactical control of things. And I think it's significant that when Jackson's gone and then when Longstreet is gone in May of 1864, that's the moment when you start to see Robert E. Lee taking effective tactical control. And he clearly does not like it. This is what happens at Spotsylvania. To a certain extent, it happens in the Wilderness. It'll happen during the siege of Richmond. He doesn't like it. First of all, he finds it distasteful, but he has to do it. Why? Because he hasn't got anyone else he can rely upon. Because the next level down of Confederate command is of such poor quality that he can't expect them to do things. He can't expect a Longstreet and a Jackson. And part of the struggle for Lee is Lee wants to be the non-micromanager, but he's dealing with an army which is forcing him to do what he does not like to do, which is to micromanage. And his successes as a micromanager are they're not always up to the level that they could have been. It's just what he doesn't like to do.
He did what we call today.
Yeah.
Tell me what you want done, not want to do it in minutia. And
Who-
that's, at that level, that's what you should be doing. Point of view.
Yeah. Look at the people who are his subordinates after Longstreet and Jackson. Dick Ewell, All right, here was someone whom everyone thought was going to be the second coming of Stonewall Jackson. Well, it does not turn out that way at Gettysburg, does it? And it certainly doesn't turn out that way at Spotsylvania. Powell Hill, here's another one. Again, very aggressive, someone who was almost a pet for Lee, because Lee was so grateful when Powell Hill's division came to the rescue at Antietam. But in terms of his actual performance in the field, Hill is a mediocrity. And Lee is always having to make up for Hill's failings. So that's Ewell, that's Hill, and it goes right down the line. A number of these other Confederate command, John Brown Gordon, bless his heart. He talked well, and he talked a lot too after the war, especially about himself. But as an effective field commander, no. There was just a real personnel shortage, and Lee couldn't do it all. Now, let me bring that to the third thing, which is logistics. There, I think Lee can probably be faulted most directly, because here is an army which is constantly short of a number of things. It's short of food all the time. It's short of clothing all the time. The only thing it's not short of is weapons and ammunition. And people have not always measured the disparity between how does the Confederacy manage to supply weapons and ammunition so effectively, but falls down in these other departments. Look at who was in command of them. In command of Confederate ordnance is Josiah Gorgas. This man is a genius. Who is in command of Confederate commissary? Lucius Northrop. This man is an idiot. And he's a pet of Jefferson Davis's, which is why he stays in his position for as long as he does. Lee, you might think at that point, should have challenged people like Abraham Myers, who was quartermaster general, or Lucius Northrop. Lee should have challenged him. He doesn't. You could have imagined at some point Lee walking into Jefferson Davis's office in Richmond and saying, you either get rid of these clowns who are sacrificing my army. You either get rid of these clowns or I'm going to walk. And if Lee had presented an ultimatum like that, which would have been very unlike him, if he presented an ultimatum like that, then that might have made a big logistical difference for the Army of Northern Virginia. I mean, usually we like to make excuses and say, well, they couldn't feed the army because, well, there wasn't enough food in the Confederacy. No, please. The Confederacy fed the Union armies and did it quite well. I mean, they foraged, they took it, but it was there to take. So if there was no problem for the Union armies feeding themselves off the Confederate agriculture, why was there so much difficulty of the Confederate army feeding itself from Confederate agriculture? Why doesn't Lee go in and demand change this way? Because of his view of the relationship between military and civilian authority. He has learned from hard experience observing what happened to Winfield Scott in Mexico when Scott challenged civilian authority. He learned what happened to his first mentor, General Gratiot, when Gratiot got involved challenging civilian authority. And he saw that the fastest ticket to disgrace for a soldier was to get into an argument with the politicians. Because to paraphrase a prominent modern politician, they have 6 ways to Sunday to destroy you. And Lee constantly keeps that line in mind. So he does not challenge Davis. And when he does not challenge the politicians, that means there's no change in the logistics of the army. So in some sense, Lee fails as a logistical director because he's not willing to do the political thing that logistics always entails. I mean, logistics is certainly one moment. I mean, strategy to a certain extent, yes, but logistics in a very practical sense is a moment where the civilian and the military have to work together. If they're not working together, a good logistician knows how to take things apart and put it back together again. The great problem for Robert E. Lee was that he was facing, in the last year of the war, a general officer who really did have all three of those put together properly, and that was Ulysses Grant. Grant was a great tactician, he was a great strategist, and he was a great logistician. And I think that makes Grant one of the greatest, if not the single greatest, military leader in American history. He was, if I can borrow an analogy from baseball, he was a five-tool player. And those don't come along very, very readily. It was Robert E. Lee's misfortune that he was stacked up against Ulysses Grant. Nevertheless, as a strategist, yes, he gets very high grades. Tactician, we're not sure about because we don't see it enough. That wasn't his philosophy. Logistician, he could have done a good deal more than he did. I think that's probably the best report card that one can turn in on Lee that way. Yes, right behind.
The question was raised why he wouldn't have stayed more in touch with his officers, and do you think perhaps that might have been part of the same strategy of not associating with groups like the KKK or not wearing his uniform? I think he was buried in civilian.
Yeah.
And not wanting to give any sign that he was inspiring, it had some kind of rear guard action going on.
Yeah, I think that if Lee had in fact called together convocations of his former senior officers, people would have raised questions. The interesting thing is he doesn't even make an effort to do that with his staffers. Walter Taylor, Charles Marshall, people like that, Armistead Long, who were very close to him. I mean, all of them write memoirs about Lee. I mean, Lindsay Long is the first, he's the first to get a memoir out. You know, Taylor actually writes two of them. Marshall's memoirs don't get published until the 1920s, but all right, still, he's written a lot of material about that. It wasn't that they lacked any kind of affection for Lee. It's that Lee manifested a very peculiar kind of indifference to the people who were close around him during the war. And it's not like the old boys network that you see with Grant or with Sherman or with the others. And you know, that is, again, one of these moments when you say, what is going on here in the mind of Robert E. Lee? It's not easily predictable. Yeah, Gordon.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to something the way was talking about how Robert E. Lee is spoken of. To what extent was Lee himself tapped into reputational streams, his own reputational streams? To what extent did he care? To what extent did he curate his reputational stream? And maybe even to what extent were myths and counter myths that you point out already present in seed during his lifetime? It's a big question.
Probably the best measure of any veteran of the Civil War's instinct to construct their own memory of themselves is the spate of memoirs that are issued in the post-war years. And of course, it begins with Grant, but it includes Sherman, it includes Sheridan, it includes McClellan. It goes through almost every senior officer in the Union armies. They're issuing memoirs like there's no tomorrow. And a number of Confederates do the same thing. James Longstreet writes, toward the end of his life, he writes a memoir from Manassas to Appomattox. So do many others. John Bell Hood, before his death, does the same thing. Many other Confederates do write the same kind of memoirs. Lee never does. Now, you might want to say, all right, but he only lived for 5 years after the war. He never had the chance. He was busy being the president of a college. All right, that'll consume a lot of your daylight waking hours. And yet he was propositioned frequently by people who wanted him to write memoirs, people who wanted him to write a history of the Southern side of the Civil War, people who wanted him to write a history of the Army of Northern Virginia. He himself put out feelers to his former officers, asking for papers, reminiscences, any kind of material that they still retained. Now, send it to him because he was toying with the idea of writing a history of the Army of Northern Virginia. He never does it. Why? All right, maybe he was too busy. Maybe if he'd lived another 5 years, maybe if he had not been increasingly debilitated by the heart condition that eventually killed him, He would have, in fact, written a self-justifying memoir, but he doesn't. In fact, he doesn't even write anything. He doesn't write an article for a periodical. He doesn't write anything that even looks like a manuscript reminiscence. There's nothing like that Lee writes. And on the one hand, you can say, well, this was an example of the man's humility, that he did not want to draw attention to himself. Well, that almost sounds like we're complimenting him too vigorously. But in a real sense, he doesn't, because he looks back upon the war as this catastrophic miscalculation, not only by his fellow Southerners, but by himself. He has made the great mistake of his life, and he doesn't know how to walk it back. And I don't have the sense from reading this enormous fire hose of correspondence of his that he ever sat there and wrote out how very proud he had been to be in command of the army that beat the daylights out of the United States Army time and time again. The only time you even get close to that is that final order at Appomattox, General Orders number 9, which, when you look at it closely, turns out not to really have been written by Lee at all. It was written by Charles Marshall. Lee did some corrections in it. In fact, Lee took out portions that Marshall had put in there, condemning the Union cause for various crimes and offenses, things that, as Marshall said afterwards, that Lee thought would antagonize feeling. But that's the only moment in which Lee does that. In fact, by contrast, I referred to this report, the final report he writes for Jefferson Davis. He's almost critical of his own army. Can it be, and I can't do any more than just suggest this as a possibility, but can it be that in fact Lee was not proud of what had happened and did not, in fact, want to draw an excess of attention to it? In 1869, an effort is made to organize a reunion of principal Union and Confederate officers at Gettysburg. They're going to have it at a big spa, which is right next to the Gettysburg battlefield. It's no longer there, but it was at that point. And the organizer of this event, David McConaughey, writes to the major commanders. He wants to invite George Meade. He wants to invite a raft of people. He writes to Lee. And Lee says, I'm really not interested. But what? This is the greatest battle of the Civil War, maybe the greatest battle on the North American continent. He says, I'm really not interested. What leads someone to draw that conclusion? I'm not going to try to supply a concrete answer because Lee doesn't himself, but it does make you wonder. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, if there is. If not, that's also a wonderful question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're amazing question. I could hear you listen to her talk about history of paint drying.
I'll put a nickel in my meter, I'll go on then.
Wonderful lecture, thank you so much. Talk about General Lee as a father. He was essentially damaged as a child.
Yeah.
And traumatized. How did that affect him when he was alone?
He is an exemplar as a daddy. And all of his children talk about that. Only one of them writes a memoir of his father, and that's Robert E. Lee Jr., the youngest of the 7 Lee children. One daughter dies during the war in 1862. But of the other surviving children of Robert and Mary Custis, every moment in their correspondence in the years that remain to them through the 19th century and into the 20th, their praise for their father is absolutely unstinting. And it's not just the conventional Hallmark Hall of Fame thing. They're always recalling these incidents that the children would gather together and tickle his feet because he liked that. I'm not sure if there's a message there. Maybe there's a physical therapist who could explain this in more Freudian terms. I don't know. But they recalled things like that, how he would go out riding with them, how he would have a special pony for one of his sons. Now he could be very strict with them, especially as the boys grew older. He wrote them letters, usually from far away, because for instance, he's in Texas, posted there. And he's writing them about how they should not read novels. Novels are fiction, puts the wrong ideas in your head. But then he also writes to Custis, the oldest one. He says, whenever your mother wants to go shopping, you need to go with her because she spends too much. So you get the sense that there is a really close bond between Robert E. Lee and his children. And once again, you acquire this question. Is this part of Lee's lifelong campaign to do right the things his father did wrong? Was his father a failure as a dad? And the answer is yes, he was. What father abandons his sons, abandons his daughters, goes off to the West Indies claiming he's trying to recover his health when he's trying to beat his creditors? I'm sorry. The man deserted his family. I don't have any better word for that. If you do, I'd like to hear it. But I look at that, and to me, that is one of the greatest crimes that an adult human being can inflict on children. And I speak from experience of myself that way, having endured a situation not unlike that. Lee's bond with his children was extraordinary. And it shows up so much in how they remembered him in years later, with an affection which simply had no boundary. They loved their father, and he loved them. And if Light Horse Harry taught him anything, it was how to be a good father. And he was. I don't know if in the ledger books that we keep on historical figures that in any measure redeems other mistakes that he made. But as I said earlier, there were plenty of worse mistakes he could have made, and he could have made some bad ones with his own children. He could have replicated his father, but he did not. To the contrary. Maybe in the end, the decision that most typifies Lee and irrevocably set him on the path toward the commission of treason. I do not use the word lightly. People sometimes are upset when I associate the word treason with Lee. Please understand, I do not say that just as a throwaway term because I'm trying to say something nasty about Robert E. Lee. I am saying that as the son of a career Army officer who took the oath, and as the father of another career Army officer who took the oath. And I took the oath, not in the Army, but when I became a member of the National Council for the Humanities, I had to take that same oath to preserve, uphold, defend the Constitution of the United States. And I take that oath seriously. And when I look at Robert E. Lee, I must say that he lifted his hand against the Constitution and he lifted his hand against the flag. And I would fight against him if I had him here today. I cannot do other than that. But why did he make the decision that he made? My suspicion is that it comes down in the end to family, because that was how he explained it. When he talked about his duty to Virginia, what did he mean? Did he mean the political Commonwealth of Virginia? I don't think so, because he hadn't lived in Virginia for most of his life. Virginia for him meant family. It meant the larger network of Carters and Fitzhughs, all these people who had come to the rescue of his mother when his father walked out, kept them all together, kept them fed, got them an education. I mean, William Henry Fitzhugh paid for Robert's older brother Carter to go to Harvard. So family is the real key here. But even within that, when Lee has to explain himself to Winfield Scott, he puts it in terms of, I can't raise my hand against my family because everything that my children own is there across the river, meaning Arlington. Light Horse Harry threw away everything that should have come to his children. Robert E. Lee will not do that, even if it means he fights against his oath and his flag. In the end of the day, the most important loyalty for Robert E. Lee is family. That is not, in the great calculus of things, a bad loyalty. It may not be the only loyalty, but it is not a bad one. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Guelzo. Thank you for coming to Stratford Hall. We hope to have Dr. Guelzo back repeatedly because we too could listen to him talk about ad infinitum. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you again very soon.